Welcome to All Together Now. This is Eleanor LeCain. Women are rising around the world. Women's voices and leadership are essential for humanity to deal successfully with our current crisis. Yet we know women are still held back in many places in many ways, such as the expectation they'll carry the lion's share of taking care of children and family, as well as being subject to greater physical and sexual abuse. Today, we'll talk about how we can achieve greater gender equity and how we can have reconciliation between genders, among genders, that can free women and men from our long history of tension. My guests today are Cynthia Brix and Will Keepin, co-founders of Gender Equality and Reconciliation International, a nonprofit organization that transforms the roots of gender imbalance within individuals, interpersonal relationships, and in society. They are also co-authors of a new book, Gender Equity and Reconciliation, 30 Years of Healing the Most Ancient Wound in the Human Family. Cynthia Brix and Will Keepin, welcome to All Together Now.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's such a privilege and a pleasure to be with you today.
Joy to be with you, Eleanor. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So let's start off. I've got this amazing book, which I loved reading. It's so rich. Maybe you can give us the headline for people who haven't read the book yet. What do you mean when you talk about gender equity and reconciliation?
Well, the book is a synopsis pretty much of our work over 30 years, as the title states. And we actually have 20 co-authors on it because our work is about community and building a new community of beloved practitioners, if you will, of people actually going deeply into their own personal journey around their gender and bringing it out. We often paraphrase the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who says, injustice and corruption will never be transformed by keeping them hidden, but only by bringing them out into the light and confronting them with the power of love. And basically, that's our work. That's our methodology and purpose of our work, is creating safe forms for people, women and men and people of all gender identities and expressions and sexual orientations, to come together and bring forward the often intimate conversations, the sensitive and taboo conversations around gender and sexuality, and doing so without shame or blame, but bringing it into the light with love, with compassion, so that we come to a place of deeper understanding of one another, deeper respect, and also mutual reverence, if you will, bringing it into a higher level of our awareness and consciousness and relational value of one another. So we have 20 co-authors because it's not just about Will and me. It's about a whole global community that's growing and bringing forth this important new way of being and healing capacity and transformation of ourselves and into the world.
Fantastic. Well, it's fascinating to me, and you start at the beginning of your book talking about kind of what's happening on the ground right now. And I've actually never seen anyone make this really important point. You say terrorism is a widely publicized threat, but the danger of that terrorism is small compared to the daily terrorism happening with domestic violence now, which is plaguing at least 1 in 3 households across the globe. And we know the data around gender violence, and it's almost, very heavily, it's male violence towards women generally. And the statistics are shocking and scary. So when I'm looking at that data and knowing people who are hit by domestic violence, it seems like such a long way to go from where we are, where it's not just a region or even a country or even a culture. It's like across the world, women are dealing with this kind of a physical and sexual assault, sometimes murder. Given that level of challenge, how how do you move beyond that, and what do you do to be able to address that honestly and then help people move into a different place where there's greater harmony and respect among the genders?
That's a beautiful question, Eleanor, and that is the burning question that led us to begin this work. The short answer is we convene forums for deep truth-telling across the gender divisions in society. And what happens, because one of the factors that keeps all of this dysfunction that you just mentioned in place is untold stories and keeping the truth from being spoken. This is a key principle. We see it, for example, in all the NDA, the non-disclosure agreements that were signed in order to keep the shenanigans of the Me Too movement in place, and essentially paying off the people who know the truth to shut up so that the dysfunction can continue unabated. And there are similar forms of dynamics across the board. So what we are doing is convening forums so that the taboo stories can be told and witnessed across the gender divisions in every institution. This issue is alive and unwell at every level, from the bedroom to the boardroom and everything in between. And so it's true what you say, as one of our colleagues in Costa Rica said to us, just as an example, Costa Rica has no military, but there's a war in every household. Another colleague from Japan used the same metaphor. Japan is a peaceful country, but there's a war in every household. There is a major conflict of domestic violence, of gender oppression that is so routine. Our colleagues from Latin America tell us how the men were trained. They were brought up with zero models of responsible masculinity as young boys, none. That's what they tell us. And they were trained to be these kind of battering patriarchs. So what we've learned, and this is the good news, and this is why we're so excited about the work we do, what we've learned is that given a chance, people want something different. And apart from a very few exceptions, there's always exceptions, but the vast majority of men want something different. And they don't know how. It's never been modeled for them. But we have learned in our work that men in particular yearn for a completely different kind of relationship with the feminine if they could have it. And they want to reconnect to their full humanity. We've also learned that men have no clue what women go through. They know that women have certain challenges, but we routinely hear in our work from men, I had no idea how difficult it is to walk through the world as a woman. And we routinely hear from women, I had no idea. Being a woman, I thought the men have all the advantages, they're fine, and we have all the problems. And women realize how much men suffer in this system that denies men and boys a fundamental part of their humanity. And also, heterosexual people have no idea how much LGBTQ people suffer in a heteronormative society. So there's all this level of suffering that's going on in a certain way with no place to be witnessed skillfully. And so the essence of what happens in our work is that we bring communities together. We spend quite a bit of time creating safety. That's very important, to create safety, create the conditions. And then we allow these truths to come forward, these stories to come forward. And what happens is that puts the whole group into a process of what we call collective alchemy. You know, in alchemy, traditionally, you go into the darkness, you go into the discomfort. And what happens is in the depths of that, you discover a light a new possibility. And you move through that and you come into the harvesting of the alchemical gold. So there's a kind of transmutation process where you go into the darkness and the shadow, the injury, the wound. And what happens, although initially the ego is threatened by that, it's like, well, I'm just going to wallow in suffering and stay in hell forever. But that's not what happens. We go through that. We face it unflinchingly, but then we move through it together. And then we discover that darkness melts away. We discover a new light in the depths of the heart. And that leads us into a new mutual compassion, mutual awakening. And the shackles of this oppressive system that have oppressed both women and men and heterosexuals and LGBTQ people, those shackles just begin to crumble. And we begin to see one another soul to soul, and we reclaim beloved community, as we call it. So that's the mission of our organization, is to eradicate gender injustice and replace it with beloved community, because that's what happens naturally if we can create a forum where the deep, painful truths can be told and witnessed without shame, without blame, and you move through the ensuing pain, you come out the other side, and you begin to birth a whole new community, a beloved community, which is ultimately our birthright as human beings.
And I just add to that the Me Too movement was so important and continues to be so important, to have women's voices come forward in sharing with such courage, right?
Right.
And what still needs to happen, the next step, is to have men's voices come forward and share, and then the healing of both coming together to be able to hear what why is this happening? What's the root cause? You say mainly male violence to women. That's true. And male to male violence is actually higher than male to female violence. So, and men's suicide rate of men is higher. And so there's a fundamental problem. And well, just the shootings, the gun violence in the United States, for example, it's men of
Mostly,
all,
not all.
no, mostly, that's right. But
Right.
it's predominantly men, and of all races, not one particular, but there's something there. What is that pain and suffering going on that's causing this violent reaction? And in our work, and we work with all kinds of people, of course, and there's stories of father wounds from any gender. There's stories of spousal abuse from any gender. And of course, we're not saying it's equal, but it's still there. And boys being told at an early age to man up, don't cry. We hear that often. Pornography is huge. And we're not morally saying, we're not moralistic about it, saying the pornography is a bad thing, but it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that's feeding all of us, and especially younger people, but also isolated people and a lot of men, about how to be sexual and intimate. It's coming from a lot of pornography, and it's ruining the bedroom,
But it's a false instruction. It's the default sex education, and it's basically giving a completely false thing about the nature of intimacy and sexuality.
Yeah.
I'm very encouraged that given your 30 years of experience, you see men actually transforming here. Because when you look at the data, which I've seen for years, and I still find it horrific, of the violence against women, it's staggering. And how are we going to stop that? And if you're telling me you've got a process that helps men become more aware and that they actually want something different. I'm reminded I recently did an interview with Dr. Carol Gilligan, who you may know from her book,
Different Voice,
Toward a Psychology of Women. And she was the one who said to her colleagues at Harvard, hey, all the people you're studying in psychology are men. We need to be looking at girls and women here because maybe they're having a different experience. But uh, Dr. Gillen was the one who was saying how damaging these gendered roles are for the men, even, 4 or 5 year old boys being taught to really, like you say, man up and cut off their connection with their emotions uh, and be tough and celebrate violence. And it's just, it's devastating. And I don't understand why, I came of age in the 1970s. It looked like we were going to throw all those gender stereotypes out the window and people could be people and men could have emotions and women could be construction workers and everybody would do what they're called to do. But somehow that hasn't happened. But there's something in your work that seems to be able to help people release the trauma that they've experienced and then access parts of themselves that they may have been cut across from. So I'm eager to learn more about, like, where did this work come from that you do? What inspired you to get into it? And how did you create this approach of workshops where you create the safety for people to share stories and really listen deeply and heal?
Well, let me speak to how this work got started. Before I do, I just want to set the record, there is substantial intimate partner violence by women against men.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
that it's a much smaller percentage, but it's a very real problem. There's also significant psychological abuse of men by women. There's the mother wound. Many people and women have a deep mother wound. So it's a complex situation. But how we got into this work, my background, I'm an environmental scientist by training. So I worked for 25 years in the area of sustainable energy solutions for global warming, basically technologies of energy conservation and renewable energy for displacing carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. And in the course of that work, back in the 80s, when I was at the height of that work, my involvement in that work, there were significant Me Too violations taking place within the mainstream environmental activist community. And these were creating a lot of suffering, and they were taboo to talk about, which is, I mentioned earlier, that's part of the signature, right? Is keeping these things hidden.
Mhm.
But it was a particular egregious contradiction because here we were, a national movement of activists actively engaged in healing our relationship with the natural ecology and environment. But in our human ecology and environment, we had this toxic crisis that couldn't be talked about. And so a group of us convened some events to address this, never intending that it would go beyond our professional networks. We simply needed to begin to address this problem that was known tacitly. People knew it was there. There were whisperings, but there was a lid on it. And the first couple of events we created, it kind of blew up in our face because we created an outlet for this to come forth. And the magnitude of the pain that was released and the outrage was quite overwhelming, actually. And some of the facilitators afterwards said, we've got to stop this, put the lid back on Pandora's box because we have an Earth to save. And a small group of us said, well, actually, I think, this is part of that saving of the Earth. And this is part of our work. But we realized just trying to talk through the issues was not adequate. We needed more effective, transformative methodologies, somatic methodologies, and emotional skill methodologies. So we started experimenting. We spent the next 3 to 4 years convening 2 or 3 of these events per year, again, only within our professional networks. And we were trying and bringing in lots of different modalities. And after, things like psychodrama and breath work and counsel process and, lots of different ways of working with these issues. And we then began to get traction and get good results. And then in the mid 1990s, I was very inspired by Desmond Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation process. And I realized what they're doing in South Africa is similar to what we're doing. I mean, on a much smaller scale, but it had the same principle was there. We're creating forums for these really dark truths to be heard and witnessed in an inclusive mixed group. And then we work with that as a group. And so we actually changed the name of our work. At that time, we called it Gender and Ecology because it was part of the environmental movement. And the byline was, are there parallels between exploitation of the earth and exploitation of the feminine? Because there are actually quite deep structural parallels there.
Absolutely.
Then we changed it to Gender Reconciliation, and then later Gender Equity and Reconciliation, because we were really invoking that lineage that Desmond Tutu was founding. We had no idea, no clue that we would ever go to South Africa, much less ever meet Desmond Tutu, all of which happened later. But we felt like we're part of that same, we're applying those same principles of truth and reconciliation for gender healing and reconciliation. So that's how it got started. And then what happened was it just started to grow. In the late 90s, we started getting invitations outside of our professional networks because others started hearing about what we were doing. Clergy and academics and psychotherapists who were not part of the mainstream environmental movement or only peripherally involved started inviting our programs in these other arenas. So that's when we had to kind of pull this together as more of a professional organization and begin to respond to these invitations. And then it just grew steadily from there. 2001, we got invited to India the first time, 2003 to South Africa. 2006, we were invited by the Deputy Minister of Health in South Africa, who convened a program for members of parliament. And that was a watershed 6-day intensive event for us. And that led to invitations all over the country that we spent the next 10 years following up on. And so it's just steadily like that. For many years, we had a policy of never going anywhere unless we were invited, and we did not market the work. It was edgy work. It was kind of a part-time side thing as I was still trying to do my environmental work, but it slowly just took over my life. I assumed naively that other organizations, when these issues come up of the Me Too, and we didn't even have that terminology then, that they deal with it. And other people are doing their dirty laundry work, and we're just doing our dirty laundry work. What we found out was, no, they're not. No one else is doing this. It was astounding. And we started getting people would invite us because we were doing a kind of work that they too needed that wasn't happening in their domain. And so that's how it really continued to grow. And now we've introduced the work in 14 countries, and we've trained about 200 facilitators, and we've become largely a training organization, training others to implement this work in their networks. And those networks range from nonprofit organizations to religious organizations to government agencies. We've done several in the UN community in New York. And all the way down to townships in South Africa and India and rural communities. So it's really been remarkable to see how the work has flowered in all these different dimensions.
Yeah, it really is incredible. And you talk about you began with the interpersonal issues happening within the environmental movement. And it seems like what happens most of the time is, as you talk about, mostly there's this veil of silence. Like people don't talk about what's going on because, people don't want to be blamed or shamed or cause trouble, so they keep silent about it. If it does start to poke up at all, mostly people just want to sweep it under the rug as quickly as possible. And who do we need to pay off and have a non-disclosure agreement and keep the lid on this thing and move on, as opposed to say, stop and go, let's look at what's happening here. Why is this happening and how can we stop it and how can we heal it and then move forward together? And I'm just so thrilled that you created this process to do it. And it doesn't surprise me that your work is resonating, with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the South African issue. I mean, there was I was in South Africa during apartheid.
Right.
People
Right.
there were expecting an absolute bloodbath.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah.
And then even, the whites were like, we're enjoying this as long as we can. But once the blacks take over, boy, they're going to come for us with the machetes. And the fact that that didn't happen, and I think the main reason it didn't was the leadership of President Mandela, and then the fact that he tasked Archbishop Desmond Tutu with this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people had a chance to hear what really happened and confront the people who were perpetrating the violence
Right.
and the problem, and then address it in a nonviolent way was, I think, one of the highlights of the human experience, that he could pull that off successfully. And in reading your
On a
book, I
national
really,
scale.
yes,
I know.
in reading your book, I really felt the parallels between the gender issue, the male, female, and then the race issue, black and white for shorthand, obviously many many colors and lots of interplay, but basically the racial problem, white and non-white, they that people don't want to look at that. It's covered with silence, and then when it peeps up, people want to sweep it under the rug. But we had a woman here, Milagros Phillips, was one of my guests recently. They call her the race healer, and I
Mm.
love her whole approach in dealing with race. It's basically like surround everyone with love, create an environment of safety, and know that everybody of whatever background you are has been damaged by racism, and you're denied your full humanity when you're subject to the prejudices based on race and the experiences that have come through history to us now at this moment. So I'm thrilled that you connected in with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and actually learned from the principles that he developed to heal this very primal wound of the gender imbalance that we're struggling with. So good
Yes,
for you.
Eleanor, thank you. And that's beautiful. And I just want to say that one of the beautiful aspects of our work and our community is that while we're focused on gender, all of the intersectionalities come forward. Because
Right.
my experience as a white woman living in North America is similar to the majority of women identified people around the world, but it's also vastly different, And so when, even in the States, when some of our Black or brown women come into the women's circle, for example, and we start sharing, there's space made for all stories to come forward. Same with the men, that the stories come forward based on whatever that experience is. Black men, brown men in the United States have a very different experience, most of them, than white men. And same with LGBTQ people. In our courses and work there, they often have open space to allow allies in, or invite allies in, let me say. And that's a really rich experience, but it's also important for them to have the space where the allies aren't there, the heterosexuals or the women and men identified, and just be safe in the space to speak about fluidity or trans issues or whatever. So I hate to say it's a byproduct, but it's a rich benefit, maybe is a better way to say what happens in our work, because it's so multi-dimensional and multiracial and multi-gendered and, multi-ages, religions, cultures, all of this abilities coming in, and everyone has a voice at the table. And that what you were speaking about of surrounding it with love, that's what King's lesson is, his wisdom is to say, lean into this. if we're not a call out group, we don't call people out on their issues. We invite people's stories. We call them in. We lean in together, and we do so with practice. We do part of our work is bringing in practices of centering in the breath, focus in the breath. We share teachings of bilateral movement, because it's not about re-triggering anyone in their story, but being able to bring your story forward, stay centered and regulated, and bring that forward so it can be released. I have an example of this, a story of a woman we named Elena for confidentiality, although she's given us permission to share. And she came in and she had a story that had been a family secret for about 20 years, and just she and her children knew. And as she went through the process, she slowly started sharing more and more. And by the time she came into the forum with everyone, and in particular with the men listening, everyone listening, but having the men there listening was part of the healing and transformation for her. She said her husband used to hang the babies over the balcony upstairs, threatening to drop them as she stood below, ready to catch them. And then she said at one point he moved his mistress into the house and made her and the children go sleep in the toilet area in the bathroom. This lasted for years upon years until he died. And then they carried this family secret at the workshop. She started sharing. And by the time she left the course, she was feeling so light, like the chains that had been binding her were, the shackles were cut. About a week after the workshop, we saw her and she came running up to us and said, "Cynthia and Will, I've got to tell you, after the workshop, I was able to go to my husband's grave and sit there and forgive him for everything he had done. And then I knew where his mistress lived, and I went and knocked on her door. I hadn't seen her in over 20 years. And I said, she came to the door, she was in a wheelchair, and she said, "Elena, I know I'm in this wheelchair for everything I did, the horrific things I did to you and your children." They were able to talk. The woman let Elena into the house. They talked, they reconciled, they found some healing. Now, nothing that we really did made that happen. It was the community. It was the skillful facilitation, sure, but it was creating this safety for everyone to come together and be able to really listen deeply without judgment, with just being there and holding space for each other and for that sharing to come forward. That's the power, the transformational power of the work. And maybe, Will, if you wouldn't mind sharing real briefly the story of the honoring ceremony that happened with the men.
Yeah, because at the end of our work, we convene these forums, and of course there's all this deep truth telling and often quite a few tears, and we have to move through the alchemy of that, and we have to not rush it, but we also don't wallow in it. So there's a very important middle pathway there. And then at some point, we come to a place where, in the case of we have 3 different program areas. We'll talk about that in a moment, but one of them is for men and women. Mm-hmm. People who identify as men and women. And in those programs, we will have then the men and the women will separate. They've actually separated several times over the course of the program, because we come back and forth in a kind of a diastolic 2-step, if you will. But they separate, and the men and women each create a ceremony to honor one another. So the men create a ceremony to honor the women create a ceremony to honor the men. And so in this particular workshop, the men came up with, the beauty of these things is that they all invent them. We never tell them what to do. We only give them a few guidelines, but they come up with the way in which they're going to honor the other. And we have seen incredible things over the years. In this particular case, the men built this tower of chairs, probably about 30 chairs, metal chairs that they built all the way to the ceiling, this huge tower. And then they had all the women coming in at the other side of the room, and they had them come in, and then the men came forward and they said, "This represents the patriarchy that men have built And our commitment is to bring this down. And then two of the men pulled out the chairs from the bottom, and this entire edifice of chairs came crashing down. It was
That's
very powerful.
powerful.
Yeah, but
You
then
know-
they came through and they had a basin of water, a bowl of water, and they washed the hands of every woman and dried them gently. Invitation, they asked if they could do that. And for Elena and many of these women, they had never felt the safe touch of a man before. And that in itself was so truly healing. And we realize in our honoring ceremonies, and we say this, we've only been there a few days doing the deep work, speaking truth. We realize we're not going to heal thousands of years of gender-based violence and oppression in that amount of time. But it's so important to come out of the stories and honor one another, to really acknowledge each other for stepping into speaking truth, for holding the space, and to honor the masculine and feminine. And so that's a power of our work that often gets missed, I think, in a lot of work, right?
Well, and I want to say,
Definitely.
I wanted to
Go ahead.
tell one more story. You said something earlier beautifully, Eleanor, about how men have to basically suppress part of their humanity. And
Right.
it's really true. It's one of the things that Bell Hooks has a beautiful way of putting it. She says that boys and young men are required to self-mutilate themselves, to basically self-mutilate part of their humanity. And if they don't do it to themselves, their peers do it to them. And
Right.
this means
Absolutely.
that young boys and men basically come into adulthood in a somewhat self-mutilated condition. And it's part of the reason that they are desensitized, and that they then are conditioned not only with that, but also with the intensive kind of pornographic formation that they get in terms of what sexuality is all about. And so what we've learned in our work, and this is so important, and we wouldn't have known that this was the case going in, is that the vast majority of men, once they wake up and realize, I don't want that way of relating, either to other men or to women. I want this respectful, collaborative, creative, mutual, joyful equality with women so we can co-create life together. I'll give you an example. We had a 24-year-old man in one of our workshops. It was an advanced workshop. There was a woman there who had gone through a brutal rape a few months earlier from someone who invaded her home. I mean, classic, horrific. She told that story at one point in precise phenomenological detail, as a bearing witness to the shattering experience of what that is. It was truth-telling at a level that no man in that room had ever heard, and almost no woman had ever heard. The level at which she laid it out. And afterwards, there was pin drop silence. And the first person to break the silence was this young man. And he said, "I don't know how to be a man anymore. I feel traumatized."
Mm-hmm.
And so we worked with him and we helped him to understand the reason he didn't know how to be a man anymore is that part of the male privilege, as it's called, is to not have to be aware of the pain of women. That's how the system works. The part of the privilege of white people is to not have to be aware of the pain of people of color. The privilege of heterosexuals is not to have to be aware of the pain of LGBTQ people. So this is how the system works. And he had opened his heart and taken in this pain, and it was transforming his very identity as a man. And it turned out to be a life-changing experience for him. A year later, he joined our full-on professional training, year-long training plus internship, and went through the whole process and became one of our facilitators of gender equity and reconciliation right there in Soweto, in the townships communities. So it was a transformational experience. And the reason he did that is because he realized there's another way of being a man that I want. And it's never been modeled. And I've never even knew that was possible.
That's fantastic. And I can imagine a lot of women would think, oh, well, men don't really want to give up their privilege. So they may talk a good game and go through a workshop, but at the end of the day, they're going to still want to be in charge. Just like a lot of blacks might feel, or people of color feel, whites don't want to give up their privilege. And that, it works. The silence works to keep the systems of domination in place. That's why I find so inspiring and so hopeful in your work is that that's actually not true. And that when you sit down and share the truth in a safe environment, that that men as well as women can see this whole construct really doesn't work and we need a different way. But I'm wondering, a lot of times people say, well, and you described beautifully, I think that was the 6-day workshop in South Africa you were referring to with the pyramid of the chairs, the closing
Yes.
ceremony, which I love that whole metaphor. That's just great. Every man takes one chair and boom, down comes patriarchy. I love it.
And afterwards, they
That's
did
how
a
I,
whole declaration, if you read in the book, to the women, a whole
yes,
commitment to basically deconstruct this thing and do whatever they could in their lives to also train the other men in their lives. And several of those men have stayed consistent to that commitment. That was 18 years ago.
Yeah.
And they are still working with us.
and that's exactly where I was going with my question is people can have a profound transformative experience in a workshop and a training, but then we go home to our lives, we go home to our homes, our workplaces. How do you know that that transformation is lasting when people go through your experience?
So there's lots of stories around that. First of all, just practically, we stay in touch as best we can for those that want to continue, because like I said, this is community work. So, and our community, global community, we say we're practitioners on the path. So we have different things that people can enter into, including GERI heart circles after a program that keeps people in smaller groups connected. That's just a practical step along with other things. But when you said, they go home to their wives and husbands and partners and families, was a man that came to a very sensitive man. He's also Buddhist. He came to our work. He went home after the workshop and he told his wife, who he had been married to 30 years, he said, I just was so touched by all the stories I heard from the women. And I was so deeply moved. And he said, I am so glad that you haven't ever gone through any of that. And she looked at him like a crazy man and she said, are you kidding? Are you crazy? I have gone through a lot of that, but we've just never talked about it. So
Right,
that's
exactly.
an example of how it continues out, And actually, we've had some contact with him in particular. And while he might not be coming back into a particular program, his life has changed. Their relationship has changed. And he shared some really touching ways that that's happened. There's also been people, even 30 years ago that did one of the first workshops. Some people have contacted you just recently about how that program changed their lives.
Yeah, we do get those kinds of emails, and we do have these follow-up programs of the heart circles. Some of them have gone on for years. It depends on the energy in the community. Others go on for a few weeks, but some of them have been sustained over several years. We also have advanced courses. We had a whole advanced series that we ran in South Africa. We're developing another advanced series now on spirituality and sexuality that we'll be offering, so that we have kind of further programs that people can do. And then we also have these networks, because we now have, in the countries that we've worked in, we have a significant group of people there who are holding the mantle of this work. And that creates a wonderful resource for people to connect with that's been just very valuable and rich.
And if I may, Eleanor, just because you brought it up earlier, Will, about saying our program areas, we have the Me Too to We Together program that is in the binary. And we do separate into men and women's groups. Everyone's invited, but we do stay in the binary because there's so much work to do in that field. We got to unpack that before maybe we become fluid. I don't know. And then we have an LGBTQ program that I mentioned earlier, and we have a BIPOC. The LGBTQ program is more fluid, and they do separate into groups, but not specifically men and women. It's much more fluid. And then we have a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color intersectionality group. And that's for people without white people in it, people who identify in those ways that are not white. And that's a very important space too for safety, that the white gaze, as you are, or as we are, the three of us are, isn't there. And deeper work can be done around being Black or brown. And so we find that that's really important. Ultimately, my dream, my hope and vision is that as we do the work in our separate groups, if you will, then we will come back together and be able to do work at a real deep level in unity together. And we do that too. But the separation is also important.
And the other thing is our LGBTQ program has a branch that works with healing between kind of straight and queer people. And they've been doing this particularly in some religious congregations where there's tension between, if a religious congregation admits LGBTQ people, there's other people who aren't necessarily happy about that because they think it contradicts their whole biblical formation, and so there's been some deep healing there. And we also did that all the way back in the 90s. We had a whole series back at the height of the AIDS crisis in the US, when so many men were dying of AIDS. And we did a series of essentially healing events between gay and lesbian communities and heterosexual communities. And it was incredibly powerful, the healing that happened and the awakenings that happened for heterosexual men, for example, to realize what the gay men were going through, losing so many of their friends to AIDS deaths, and the pain they were in, and the shame they were carrying because of the judgment coming from the conservative, religious type of communities saying, well, that's your punishment for being gay, and all of those kinds of incredibly painful dynamics and it was such an awakening for those of us who were heterosexual men to really open our hearts fully to the plight of the gay and lesbian community in a very heteronormative society. All of these things are human-made divisions. They're not real.
Right. We built the walls, we can bring them down.
That's right.
And that's one thing we say, the patriarchy, as we call it, that's a word for it, is a human invention. And it had a beginning and it will have an end by human intervention. We can deconstruct this thing. We are witnessing the deconstruction of it routinely in our programs. We had a cohort of 28 students. That's the other thing you asked about follow-up. We do have long-term programs taking place like in universities. We had one for a whole year with a group of 28 students. They did 2 of our 3-day programs, one in the fall and one in the spring. And then they met once a month for half a day as a follow-up. And with that level of intervention, this was then all mapped out and carefully researched with approval from the ethics committee. And then all of the conversations and everything were recorded and transcribed and then analyzed by the researchers. One of the researchers was the one who worked closely with Desmond Tutu on the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. She was the one who invited this whole program. And their conclusion was that those students excavated their gendered experiences and basically freed themselves from the shackles of this system that oppressed them all, men and women alike. And it was a very profound experience. And they concluded that this kind of work should be mandatory for every student entering the university environment. Well, of course, we love that because that was an independent research team that came to that conclusion.
There you go.
Yeah.
And that was in South Africa?
That was in
It
South
was.
Africa at the University of the Free State and Stellenbosch University, and it's actually documented in chapter 24 of our book, is all about research, written by the
Well, boy,
researchers themselves. Yeah.
let's do it in universities all over the world.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's do it.
Why not?
We're ready.
It's important.
Well, yeah. And speaking of which, I think someone who could help make that happen that I came to mind as I was reading your wonderful book is Melinda Gates, who is
Yeah.
very committed to having, upgrading women. So we're flying on both wings of humanity. I don't know, have you connected with Melinda Gates at all? I think she would love your work.
Well, Melinda, if you're out there listening, please let us know.
Well, we actually have the second printing of our book is due out in a couple of weeks, and we've got some nice revisions on the cover and stuff. As soon as it comes out, we'd love to send her a copy.
Yeah, definitely send her a copy. And listeners, if you know Melinda Gates, please contact me, and we're going to get the show on the road to get Melinda Gates a copy of this book and pay attention to this groundbreaking work that we're learning about here. We just have a few minutes left, and I want to ask you a couple of things still. And one is, you've been at this a long time now, 30 years. Your book is a fabulous summary of incredible work, kind of the methodology, the thinking, the practice. As you say, it's not a philosophy, it's a practicum.
Yeah,
it's done by experience with these training. What would you say are your biggest learnings and your biggest takeaways from doing this work for 30 years?
The first one is that this system of injustice, sometimes it's called patriarchy or gender injustice, is thousands of years old, but it's only a few days deep. Literally, we find that if you convene a forum skillfully, the level of truth-telling that is able to take place in these forums, the whole thing begins to be revealed as chains of clay, and they start crumbling before our eyes. We've seen that happen consistently in every culture we've worked in. And that is a testimony to the power of truth and love. This system of injustice cannot withstand the twin powers of truth and love. And it literally crumbles in the face of them. So as we say, untold stories keep oppression invisible and in place and intact. But when we can convene a forum to really tell these stories, what happens is men cannot hear the deep pain of women and remain the same men. Women cannot hear the deep pain of men and remain the same women. Heterosexuals cannot hear the deep pain of LGBTQ people and remain the same people. When we receive and hear the pain of the other and experience it in our hearts as our own pain, then there's a bridge across our hearts that transforms us both and takes us into a place of beloved community. It takes us to the place that the mystical poet Rumi talks about, where he says, out beyond right and wrong, there's a field, I'll meet you there. And we would expand that to say, out beyond male and female, there's a field, I'll meet you there. Out beyond, white and black, out beyond hetero and LGBTQ, there is a field where soul meets soul. And that's what happens in this work. We reach that place where the veils drop away and we see one another soul to soul, and we reawaken the magic of that beloved community.
And I'd say that patriarchy cannot withstand the twin powers of truth and love when applied in community settings. That untold stories keep oppression invisible, but the truth sets us free. And sharing our deepest truth sets us even more deeply free. And it heals the gender divisions in the human family. The work transforms each of us and transforms the patriarchal community and replaces it with beloved community, which we so need. There, who the woman will spoke of, Pumla Gobodo Madikizela, that spearheaded this research on her work, says that what we most need now is to make public spaces intimate. And the Me Too movement started doing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
We
Right.
all need to be at the table with the power of love, with the power of trying to understand more deeply what's happening with each other, to meet each other with a sense of curiosity and a sense of openness to really listen and hear and find out what's going on with each other and hold each other in that space of compassion.
You know, every
Beautifully
human being,
said by you both. Thank you. Go
Mhm.
ahead, Will.
I was just going to say, every human being brings a unique voice that is part of the solution. They bring a contribution to life that is infinitely precious, and they have the capacity to sing a irreplaceable melody in the symphony of life. And this work helps each person to reclaim their authenticity and bring their true contribution to life. What we find is that men in particular discover that the greatest male privilege is not any of the advantages that are afforded to men in a patriarchal society. The greatest male privilege is to actively participate in deconstructing this whole unjust system and to collaborate creatively as equals with women in building the community of the beloved. And we have learned that most men want that and didn't even know it was a possibility. They don't know how to start. They didn't even know it was an option, but that's what they truly want. We've had men who have come with years of pornography addiction that they are shedding, and they discover what they really want is intimacy with the feminine. And they want authentic intimacy with real human beings. And that is something that's not been modeled and not been given and trained as an option for many men.
Intimacy that's non-sexual, that it is totally, a platonic and in a place
Emotional.
emotional and deeper friendship. And I just in closing, I want to say that because Will, you brought it up about women also can be abusive and
Definitely.
and emotionally and all that. And I myself, I've gone through Me Too movement of sexual harassment in the workplace. I had a marriage of 16 years and my husband at that time decided to leave me for a younger woman. I've had my own traumas. I've experienced date rape, acquaintance rape, and all these things. All of us have, or almost all of us have, some kind of trauma in our life. And then at some point, some of that in my life started getting projected out to men in particular, in my anger, my betrayal. And I had to do that deeper healing work to come into an awareness around that, of how I was violating or causing harm to another, just emotional harm, if nothing else. And so I just want to acknowledge that. And everyone in our work, facilitators included, share their stories. So we're not sitting there, having everyone else share, and we do the work at the same time. Yeah.
Fantastic. And how can listeners learn more about your work? Is there a website people can go to?
We have a website, grworld.org, and for genderreconciliationworld.org. We also are on all the social medias channels and handles, Gender Equity and Reconciliation International. We welcome you, Eleanor, to come into the work at some point. We'd love to have you come participate. And all your listeners, you're most welcome, warmly welcome to come experience this work with us.
Absolutely. Sign me up.
All right.
So for today, that's all the time we have, but I just so admire the work the two of you have done. I can just see the two mighty rivers of truth and love coming to smash patriarchy, wash it away,
That's
and so
right.
we can all live in the beloved community as full human beings and have the life we deserve. Um, Cynthia Brix and Will Keepin, authors of the fabulous new book, Gender Equality and Reconciliation, 30 Years of Healing the Most Ancient Wound in the Human Family. I encourage all our listeners to read it. Thank you so much for being with us today and for all your important work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. It's such a joy to have this hour with you. Thank you.